I learned this from one of my great diplomatic forebears who said, you know, if you yell quiet, nothing happens, but if you go shh, everybody's childish reflexes kick in and they shut up. So welcome back. Don't look like we lost too many. So we're now going to have a panel to look at various aspects of this whole business of democracy and diplomacy, and particularly elections. And I would say Americans tend to have kind of decided that democracy is elections and elections are democracy. And I think this has often led us into rather perilous situations. We've gone to elections in a number of countries where I've been, where we've gone much too quickly before the political culture had really gelled. There tends to be an American kind of default belief that everybody's like us. First of all, it's not true. Secondly, it's probably a good thing. But in any event, political culture is a big piece of countries, and countries that come out of essentially zero-sum politics. You either have power and you make decisions for others, or you don't have power and you're a suppliant and you make requests. That's not a culture that necessarily teaches you from the get-go to compromise. It might be a culture that can teach us something because we seem to be losing the ability to compromise, but in any event, it does not yield easily to some of the niceties of democracy. There's also there's an interplay between democracy, elections, and security, that when countries are secure, people feel a good deal freer to move around politically. When they feel that security is in danger, there is much more tendency to move to whoever or whatever they think can provide security, even if it is reprehensible in many other ways. And so the whole business of the interaction of elections and diplomacy, it is complicated and it's turbulent. And we thought, we certainly won't discuss every bit of it, but we thought that we could kind of pull out three main elements. And so I'm going to invite my colleagues to come up. First, Dr. Graeme Bannerman. Graeme, come on up and have a seat. He's a scholar at the Middle East Institute, board chairman emeritus of Hands Along the Nile, member of the Board of Partnership for Secure America. We work with them on that, and also all kinds of other things. Graeme and I first knew each other in the State Department, and then he went off and worked in the Congress, and now he's one of my foremost advisors on how to work with the Congress at the Academy as we try to manipulate, work, and maneuver to get some legislation passed. And then if I could have Ambassador Wanda Nesbitt come on up. Wanda. And she's a more recent retiree. You know, I've been gone for a long time. She left 2019, 38-year career. She served as ambassador in Madagascar, Cote d'Ivoire, and Namibia, as well as numerous other posts. I'm not going to read any of the bios because you have them in your program, and you can read them for yourself. But she has vast experience, and so she's going to talk about some of the dimensions of elections in a country where elections move things around. And then I'd like my colleague Phil Kosnet to come up and join us. Phil was ambassador in Kosovo, career foreign service officer. I first met Phil when he was running a small post for what we called the Coalition Provisional Authority. That was what we called our occupation authority in Iraq. And he was being attacked every night by he was holding the post with an odd coalition of civil servants and bureaucrats and a couple of odd army people, and it was a fascinating experience. I came down to see if we could hold the post, because I thought I needed tell Bremer about that. And, so there's Phil running this quasi-military operation, big bay. They all lived in one building because the trailers they normally lived in got all shot up, so they just go back there and shower in the morning and come back. And it was a fascinating place where they had a big bay, and I still remember they would have all these desks, and then in between the desks they had rifles and machine guns and body armor piled up, and they would sit there at night when they were done working, and they would watch more movies until the real shooting started. Then they would go up to the roof for the gun battle. This was another version of diplomacy, but not so much about elections. But Phil is going to give us another look at what happens when you're in a country and your host government changes, that is to say ours, and you have to explain this to the locals. So Graeme, would you start us off?
I'm supposed to talk about the general looking at elections and how we do this and our validation and the like. But let me just say, we transformed the way we look at diplomacy and elections in the 1980s. We created a whole institutions nationwide for the nation. We created the National Endowment for Democracy, and then under that, you had the Free Trade Institute from the AFL-CIO was funded, and so was the Institute from the Chamber of Commerce, and the National Democratic Institute, and the International Republican Institute, and they were the instruments by which we were going to promote democracy. But every time we've ever promoted this, the problem is there's a dispute within the United States on how we do this. It's always been this way. We have those who believe the United States should be a city of light on the hill, as President Reagan said, and therefore we will provide people any assistance they can have in order to achieve a democracy. Then we have the other point of view. What we need to do is pressure people to do the right thing. So it's a conflict between inspiration and intimidation. And we've always had both sides of that in our democracy promotion. Even back at the end of World War II, for example, when MacArthur was the governor of Japan, he was getting huge pressure from the people saying, why don't you have a new constitution in Japan? You have to have a new constitution in Japan. If you don't do that, you need to impose it on it. And MacArthur said, no. If I impose it on it, that constitution only lasts for as long as I'm in the country. They have to struggle with it. It's going to take time, and they're going to work it out, but they will get there, and it'll be something that lasts. Same thing happened with the Philippine elections in '86 between Marcos and Aquino. There were those people on Capitol Hill said we need to cut aid to him as long as Marcos is there. He's a dictator. We have to get rid of them. And then there were those who said, like Senator Lugar was chairman of the committee and my boss, he said, no, we need to just keep the relationship, and then over time we can get it to change. And what you needed to do at that time was to get the person at the other end, Marcos in the case, convinced that a good idea was for the Americans to send a delegation of observers, and then they could come there and they would be there and accept it. And that happened because Marcos got trapped on Nightline with Ted Koppel, and he said, I'd accept a delegation by Senator Lugar, and off they went. And in the end, it ended his going out of power. Then you also have to know that we also balance democracy promotion with American interest. They're not necessarily congruent. And so therefore, when you reach a problem, you have to balance those two things. And there is no right answer. One of the examples I give to that is the apartheid system in South Africa. We were divided in the country over what we should do about apartheid. There were those who said apartheid is a blight, which it was. No one disagreed on that. But do we sacrifice our interest? And what our interest was, during the Cold War, South Africa had access to certain key minerals that were vital to our defense industry, and only place outside the Soviet Union there in abundance. So how do you balance those two things? In the end, I'll be very serious, what happened was it became a democratic issue starting in '84. They began city councils and doing these things. The Republicans resisted it. Finally, Senator Lugar decided that it was time for everybody to get on board, and we had to do something about South Africa. We had to do something. And a bill was developed, which, by the way, since I was part of the drafting of it, it was terrible. It was a balance between those who want to engage with South Africa and those who wanted to get out of South Africa, but we called it an anti-apartheid act. And the key was, it was called an anti-apartheid act. And finally, we put together a coalition of Republicans and Democrats. It passed. Then the question was, what do we do with the House? The House had a bill that was total sanctions, and nothing happened. So Senator Lugar met with the Ron Dellums and Mickey Leland, who was chairman, the co-chairs of the Black Caucus, and said, you have to take our bill, word for word, comma for comma, because if you don't, when it comes back to the Senate, Jesse Helms and his people will filibuster it and it'll never pass. And they said, well, I got some provisions in there that are kind of bad, And we said, we understand that. But if you don't get it, we won't have anything. And he said, what I'll do for you is if you pass the bill, our bill, word for word, I will go to the president, Reagan, and ask him to sign it. Lugar had the record of the most support for Reagan of any senator voting with him. And then he said, and if President Reagan decides not to, I will lead the effort to override the veto. They finally, Leland and Dellums thought that was fair. The bill passed, it went to Reagan, Lugar went to Reagan, Reagan said no, he vetoed it. Lugar led the override of the veto. It was the only foreign policy veto in the Reagan administration because we had put together this terrible bill that had at least political support. And that was necessary. That's where you compromise between what it was the democratic approach, South Africa sanctions were terrible, and our mineral interests. Everything worked out in the end. In addition, the thing about observers, the NDI was very good. They never had a delegation that was pure Democrats. They had international delegations, and they had many foreigners on it who participated, and occasionally they had Republicans. They would always try to get some. So it was an effort to promote democracy. The other thing on this, you had to be sensitive to countries that had different cultures. And we had to understand those countries. If you didn't, you're lost. Let me give 2 examples. Lebanon. In Lebanon, they've had elections forever. But people in Lebanon do not vote as individuals. They vote for their community. It doesn't matter what I think, what happens to my community. I was an election observer there, for example, in 2009. I was sent down, and I'm always sent to the great places. I was sent down to South Lebanon along the Israeli border, the home of Hezbollah in all its strength. There were Christian villages down there, okay? One that's all Roman Catholic. Do you think they voted as Roman Catholics or for the health of their village? If they could not, because everybody knows the whole village votes one way, and all their Shia neighbors will know they're not supporting the community if they voted as if the Northern does. Similarly, up north in Byblos, there's an area of Shia in the Christian areas in the mountains. They voted like Christians, because that's how you stay alive in that community. Or you look at a country like Egypt. Egypt, for example, is not a country. They do not see themselves as a country. They see themselves as a civilization. And a country that views themselves as a civilization acts differently than a country that sees themselves as a country. I mean, this is the problem we have with China and Iran. They see themselves as civilizations. In addition, in Egypt, basis of our democracy is one person, one vote. We are sovereign. Our sovereignty rests with us as individuals. And when we have, and in Egypt it's the opposite. Sovereignty rests with the government. Now, I'm not to say there's not a veneer of 2, 3, 4, 5% of the population that is into the Western culture has changed. But the mass is still sovereignty rests with the government. And how does that work differently? If you believe sovereignty rests with the individual, a law is some way we're giving up our sovereignty to the government, because all power belongs to us, and the law gives some power to the government. If sovereignty rests with the government, the law is giving up the government sovereignty to the people. So Egyptians can be happy with the law, and we say, oh, they're just restricting all your freedoms. They say, no, we had no freedoms. They're giving us some freedoms. And so you have to understand these differences. Sometimes when you see an election, it's hopeless. I've been to elections that are hopeless. I went to Haiti in 1987. That election, I was supposed to go up to Cape Haitian in the north, but the day I was supposed to go on the airplane, they closed down the airport, so we could not go. So we stayed in Port-au-Prince. And the night of the election, gas stations were burned, polling places were burned. I was paired up for that election with a Venezuelan. This is back when Venezuelans had good guys. And a Filipino. So we said, our drivers didn't come, no cars. So we said, why don't we get a cab and go down into Port-au-Prince and see how the situation is? Okay, you come down the hill from where we were, Peytonville, and you go down there, and the first thing you go by is a gas station that's burnt out. Okay, that's not a good sign. And then you go into the city and you drive around. There are no cars on the street. You drive past a polling spot, and there's ballots blowing around, some are burnt. This is not going well at all. Then you drive around the corner, and then behind us, a car pulls up, following us, with 4 guys with guns. And they start shooting at us. And so it's like a Chicago gangster movie. We're going like, it may have been 30 seconds, it may have been a minute, but it seemed like an eternity. I'm fighting the Venezuelan for the low spot on the back seat. That's all I'm saying. And so, always being an optimist, we finally get away and we're going up the hill. And so, I'm always an optimist. So I said to the Filipino, I said, I got some good news and some bad news for you. And he said, what's that? He said, the good news is, no, the bad news is, it looks like democracy had a setback here in Haiti. The good news is, we may be able to reprogram some of the Haitian aid to the Philippines. Always looking for ways to make things. Sometimes, reaching an agreement among the observer delegation is impossible or difficult. In the 1996 elections in Palestine, this is the first elections under Oslo when they came back. By the way, anyhow, I was there. I was sent to Gaza. And there were basically 3 different elections in Palestine at that time. Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. This was a joint Jimmy Carter NDI delegation, and I was a token Republican. In Gaza, where I was, the Palestinian Authority had been there for 2 years. Their intelligence guys had penetrated the system. And in doing so, they had won the elections before there were any votes because they controlled everybody who was on the ballot. And that's how they put their guys into power who came from Beirut or someplace outside. They all ran in Gaza. On the West Bank, no one had control yet. You had traditional leadership. So there was a real election where people fought. It was terrific. In East Jerusalem, the Israelis did not want these guys participating in the election, and they did everything possible to stop them from participation. So when we got back together, I was chosen as the spokesman for the Gaza people. And we sat down in this room with all of us. We had seen 3 different elections. We could not reach a consensus on what our report should say. By the way, we as observers, you're not there to tell people what to do. That's not your business. What you're there for is to look at the elections and see if how they can do better. This may good. You may want to do this. It's not. You do not want to be an outsider telling people how to run their country. You cannot do that. It doesn't work. And sometimes we're hypocrites. And that really is a problem for us. In 1994, I was part of a National Democratic Institute delegation that was trying to convince the Palestinians to participate in the elections of 1996. We went to Tunis to see Arafat. We then came to West Bank and Gaza. In Gaza, we met with a group of people. And I like to say I did a brilliant presentation on why they should participate. And this one guy says to me, I'm the foreign minister for Hamas. Now, Hamas was not on the terrorism list that way. I'm not meeting with a terrorist. And he said, does this mean your government will let us take over power if we win fairly? I didn't really have an answer. 2006 elections, my 3rd Palestinian election to see, it was very interesting because the Palestinian Authority Arafat was gone, and it began to lose its influence. there was this big sign that was over the street in Ramallah that sort of encapsulated the feeling of the time. And it read, Israel and the United States say no to Hamas. What do you say? Hamas won the elections. They won the authority. We did not recognize them. We put pressure on the Palestinian Authority not to work with them. We worked with the Israelis because the way that the money that goes to the Palestinian government is collected by the Israelis, and they turn it over to them when they want to. So we convinced them not to turn any money over to the Hamas government. And we, as part of what's called the quartet, gave almost all the international aid, and we stopped giving any money to the Hamas government. In addition, within a year, most of the Hamas parliamentarians who got elected were in Israeli jails from the West Bank, not Gaza. Gaza was sort of separate to the West Bank. And we helped train a battalion of Palestinian Authority soldiers in Jordan. We moved them around to Egypt, and they tried to enter Gaza and move the Hamas people out of Gaza, and they lost. And that was what we call a coup by Hamas against the Palestinian Authority. For our reputation as election observers, it's a disaster for us internationally. Put aside the problems in Palestine. It shows that most people now in the global South believe we used promotion of democracy as a part of American imperialism. Today, the former government of Pakistan, Imran Khan, and the former government of Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina, both stand up and say, we're not in power because the Americans didn't want us. Now, does that mean do we quit promoting democracy? No. Does it mean that we should be a little more sensitive and listen a little better? Yes. And I think I am committed to our promoting it, but we need to be, how do we help you do it? How do we help you get there? And what is your time frame? And the world would be a better place if we did that. Thank you.
One man, one vote, one time. So, Wanda, to carry us forward into what happens when the country's elections just messes up all the things we think we're doing.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you all for inviting me. I want to give you a slightly different example of an election that caused a dilemma for the United States and kind of how we ultimately worked through that. It has to do with an election that took place in Madagascar in 2001. And let me start by saying you don't need to know very much about Madagascar to appreciate this story. What you probably do need to know is that Madagascar is halfway around the world. It's about as far as you can go before you start coming back. And it's important to know that because from a Washington perspective, it means, or at least it did at the time, I won't speak for today, that we had virtually no strategic interest in Madagascar. And that does make a difference in terms of how people in Washington view a situation and what they're prepared to do about it. So it's December 2001. There's a presidential election. I was not in Madagascar at the time, let me specify that. But what we were told was that the results of the presidential election were quote unquote inconclusive. And in all likelihood, what would happen was that there would need to be a runoff election to decide the winner. So I'm sitting in Washington getting ready to go out to be the ambassador to Madagascar, and this is what I'm being told, and I'm doing my consultations as we do. We go around and we talk to people in different agencies, and I get on a plane to go to Antananarivo, Madagascar, the capital, with a very, very clear understanding that U.S. policy is the results of the election were inconclusive. It is up to the Malagasy political system to figure out what to do next. This is not our problem to fix. This is not our issue to resolve. We respect the people of Madagascar, and we expect them to resolve this issue. So off I go. And in the meantime, we were going to continue to recognize the president, the sitting president of Madagascar, who was a man named Didier Ratsirok. He had been president for 26 years. Keep that in mind. He had been president for 26 years. He was not necessarily our best friend in the world. He, at one time, had described himself as a self-proclaimed Marxist, but he was a known quantity. And he had the very, very strong backing of our friends, the French. So I get to Madagascar. I go around and I do the things that all new ambassadors do. I meet the staff, I talk to them, I go present my credentials to the president, I go and talk to other people in the government and in the diplomatic community, and it took me all of about 2 weeks to figure out that we were wrong. No one I spoke to thought the results of the election were inconclusive. I shouldn't say that, because it's not as if somebody made up that information and gave it to Washington. At the time, there were no election monitors, because Ratsirok didn't want any, and he'd been president long enough to make sure that there weren't any. So there were no election monitors. The inconclusive results were announced immediately following the election, before people in Madagascar civil society really had an opportunity to look into things closely. And so it was an example of somebody grabbing the headline, and that was the story that was told, and that was the story that stuck. And so there we are, there I am, and I go around and I'm talking to people, and it becomes clear fairly quickly that the vast majority of the Malagasy people are tired of the guy who's been president for 26 years. They want him gone. He's not quite ready to go. Surprise, surprise. But also that in addition to public sentiment, there is a feeling among what people in diplomacy will call the political class, that in fact the election results were tampered with to make it look closer than it was, and to justify the need for a runoff election. But of course the issue for us is, what do we do about this? I had very clear policy instructions and I was sticking to them. And so was everybody else in the diplomatic community and in the international community. So, at least initially, our position was very clear. This is an issue for Madagascar to resolve. This is not our problem to fix. I mentioned to you that I went out in January. So in February, Marc Ravalomanana, who was the opposition candidate, he declares himself president. And he starts to set up his own administration. Now, you can imagine this presents even more of a dilemma for the US government, because now we have somebody who's saying, I won the election, and I want you to recognize me as the legitimate leader of the country. We didn't know quite what to do. I wasn't prepared to say, because I didn't have any basis for it, to people in Washington that we should recognize him, although I had been saying to people, we have misunderstood the perceptions of the Malagasy people about the results of the election being inconclusive. In fact, within this country, there is no disagreement. People are genuinely agreed that there was not, that the results were not inconclusive, that they were tampered with. But that was not obvious to anybody in Washington yet. So we have this situation where we now have an opposition leader who's declared himself the official leader. And I don't mean this to be sounding too cynical, but being the good diplomats we were, we agreed that we would do nothing. And we did nothing, because we could not recognize somebody who we didn't have any basis for recognizing. We could not come out and say that he was wrong because we didn't have any basis for that. So we said, we continued with our policy, which is, this is an issue for Madagascar to resolve. This is not our problem to fix. So we come to March, and fighting breaks out between Ratzirak supporters and Reevaluate supporters. And it becomes increasingly difficult for people in Washington, I would say, to ignore pleas from the embassy, from the ambassador, to say, we are not being helpful to the situation by being neutral. We need to speak more forcefully. We need to take a stance. But we still had no basis on which to take a stance. I tell you this in part because, the desire to stand on the sideline we thought was the safest position. But when fighting broke out, and it was never a threat to the capital, but there were clashes scattered around the country, and they presented enough of a threat that we had to call in all of our Peace Corps volunteers from their sites around the country. We very quickly went from that stance to a stance where Air France said they were no longer going to fly in and out of Madagascar. And we found ourselves pushed into a situation where we had to make a decision to evacuate non-essential personnel from the embassy because there was no way for them to get off the island if there were no Air France flights. So this is March, and we are still on the same policy. And I really do not want to sound cynical, and I want to stress that behind the scenes, every day, I was talking to people in the Africa Bureau, I was talking to people in Washington, and there was increasing sympathy towards some of the things that the embassy was recommending. But as Ron Newman said this morning, policy doesn't change overnight. It takes a long time. And if you're going to ask people to do a 180-degree switch, you got to give them some pretty solid basis on which to do it. So we come to April, and the country and Madagascar's High Constitutional Court, which is the equivalent of our Supreme Court, they stipulated that Marc Reevaluate was the winner of the election and should be declared the president of the country. And we thought, this is it. Now we have a court decision, the equivalent of their Supreme Court. Now we can take the next step. But President Ratzirak, president for 26 years, says the court is wrong, and I'm not leaving office, and I would like to have a runoff election. And so we once again found ourselves in a stalemated situation, and it was fascinating for me as well as frustrating as an ambassador to come to the realization that the things that were apparently clear to me sitting in Madagascar were not at all clear to people sitting in Washington. And these are not people who had bad intentions or were bad civil servants or were not trying to do their utmost. It was simply that sitting in two different places, we had two different perspectives on what was happening. We ultimately, I use the term, we ultimately prevailed, meaning that as the fighting went on from April till May, and as our discussions with people in Washington expanded, the tide began to shift, and more people began to agree that there was a stalemate and that no one in Madagascar was going to be able to resolve that stalemate, and perhaps the only way the situation was going to get resolved was if someone in the international community stepped in and took action. And so ultimately, we agreed, and I persuaded folks back in the department in Washington that we should take the step of officially recognizing Marc Reevaluate as the leader of Madagascar. It was not an uncontroversial position because, as I've described to you, there were very, very legitimate reasons to go the other way. I felt strongly that the will of the people had been demonstrated, and that if promoting democracy was really going to mean anything, that we kind of had to, walk the walk and not just talk the talk. And when the court decided that he was the winner, it seemed to me that we should respect the will of the people and recognize the person who they very clearly wanted to be their leader. And so ultimately, I did get approval from Washington. We timed it very, very nicely so that on the 26th of June, which was Madagascar's Independence Day, I was authorized to deliver a letter to President Ravalomanana stating from the Secretary of State, recognizing him as the leader of the country. It was a dramatic moment, if you will, for that country because it represented a breakthrough that they had not necessarily known how else they would get through. It was a little bit risky and a little bit dicey, but 24 hours later, President Mr. Ratsirak got on an airplane and went into exile in France. And everybody kind of cheered and gave a sigh of relief. Now, the lesson, that's not the end of the story. We found ourselves with not only a willing partner, but a man who was so grateful for the help that the United States had given him that he never forgot it. This is not to say he went on to be the best president that Madagascar had ever had. He'd had many flaws, and he continued to have many flaws. But there was a gratitude, and the lesson I took away from that is that sometimes saying it's not our problem to fix is maybe not the right answer. And sometimes pushing back on Washington and saying, I think we're doing the wrong thing here, and we have an opportunity to do the right thing, is the right thing to do. So thank you very much.
And Phil, you had the perhaps opposite experience of representing the United States when we changed.
Graeme, Wanda, tough act to follow. Thank you. Ron, thank you for that evocative remembrance of the days of extreme diplomacy. Okay, so I'd like to offer thoughts on two topics. How an embassy adapts when a new administration arrives in Washington with radically different policy ideas, and how Americans can encourage our vision of democracy and freedom abroad at this time of domestic political turmoil. Okay. Let me start by asking, what does it mean to represent the United States? In my view, American diplomats abroad have three complementary roles to perform each day. First, we traditionally speak of diplomacy as the pursuit of national interests, political, economic, security goals for the most part. That's job one for most diplomats, Americans included. A second priority is to protect our citizens abroad, and by building secure alliances, to contribute to the security of Americans at home. Now, this beautiful setting today reminds me that Thomas Jefferson led America's first efforts at what today we might call a whole-of-government approach to counterterrorism. Jefferson first attempted, while serving as minister to France in the 1790s, to negotiate an end to the Barbary pirates' attacks on American commercial shipping in the Mediterranean. When that diplomatic effort failed, as president in 1804, he dispatched the Navy and Marine Corps to the shores of Tripoli, a phrase that you've heard, to solve the problem through force. And State Department diplomats followed up by negotiating a ceasefire and the return of American hostages. So protecting Americans abroad through diplomacy when possible and by force when necessary is a long tradition. But we speak less often of the third leg of this diplomatic triad, promoting national values. Now, we could be here into the evening defining and discussing American national values, but I'm comfortable starting with Mr. Jefferson's formulation in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, I noticed at the gift shop at Monticello, they have a lot of goods for sale that define this now as life, liberty, happiness, and coffee, which is a very 21st century interpretation that I am comfortable with. America's representatives abroad have long wielded both carrot and stick to encourage other countries to adopt this American vision. Tactics have varied over time, but the goal remains familiar: to make them more like us. In the 1890s, our colonialist endeavors in the Philippines and Hawaii echoed the European vision of a civilizing mission. In the 1960s, President Kennedy introduced the Peace Corps, declaring that every volunteer will know that he or she is sharing in the great common task of bringing to man that decent way of life which is the foundation of freedom and a condition of peace. In 1977, the Carter administration introduced the State Department's annual Human Rights Report, meant to shine a public spotlight on abuses in every country on the globe. Now, friends and adversaries alike rail against the hubris of the US government every year when the report hits the streets. But still, the human rights reports have often gotten results, in part by encouraging civil society activists and ordinary citizens abroad to challenge the status quo in their countries. Now, naturally, persuading others that America is a role model for other societies can be a tough sell. Not everyone on this diverse planet wants to organize themselves like us, even if they choose to wear blue jeans and enjoy American pop culture. People don't generally like to be lectured, particularly by outsiders, and even people who like the idea of democracy for themselves don't necessarily see the United States as a role model. And many of my colleagues will attest that in the last decade, it has not been an easy time for Americans to preach this American gospel abroad. These days, it is not unusual to be told by foreign leaders and citizens that America has not earned the right to comment on other societies' shortcomings, and its envoys should just shut up for a change. As ambassador to Kosovo from 2018 to 2021, during the dramatic transition from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, I was luckier than most chiefs of mission in that Kosovo considers itself the most pro-American country on earth. Kosovo had been independent only since 2008, and while it has made progress in building a multi-ethnic democracy and fighting corruption, it has had a lot of work left to do. The U.S. has been a hands-on partner in this endeavor through aid, consultants, even embassy advisors working inside some ministries. So people remain interested in what American diplomats have to say, even when we are being more direct and even directive than would be acceptable in most countries. One development that took our host by surprise is that many of the U.S. government's policies towards Kosovo and the Balkans did not change much during the transition from the Obama administration to the Trump administration, and then from Trump to Biden. I mean, we seek closer relations, security, improved security, and economic development and trade throughout the Western Balkans. We used to talk about building peace, justice, and prosperity in the region. Now, tactics changed. Under the Trump administration, there was more of a tendency to put down the carrot and pick up the stick with sanctions over policy agreements. But many of our goals did not change that much. Okay. That said, stepping away a little bit from just talking about policy, I found that the key to being taken seriously by host officials and the public in Kosovo, particularly after January 6th, was to approach discussions of democracy and rule of law from a position of strategic humility. In public diplomacy, such as TV interviews and published essays, and in personal discussions, I tried to be frank about how Americans had been working for 250 years to establish democracy with liberty and justice for all. And, we haven't done it yet. We clearly don't have all the answers, and we can't pretend to have all the answers. And people tended to respond well to that acknowledgement. While my staff and I continued to call out the need for progress in building Kosovo's democratic institutions and to work with our local partners in practical ways to build these institutions, I tried to emphasize the need for democracies to work together to find solutions. So, my advice to Americans working on the global stage to advance the cause of democracy, individual freedom, and rule of law is threefold. First, don't give up. Stay in the fight. Seek to lead with both confidence and humility. With authoritarianism on the rise, this is no time for American isolationism. And on democracy and rule of law, as on so many other issues, most countries want to see America participating, so long as we seek to exercise leadership through collaboration, not domination. And when I speak of America's role in advancing democracy, I see a role for non-governmental organizations and individual citizens, like the people in this room, as well as government officials. Second, I would advise that we avoid speaking in absolutes when discussing the role of government. I find the current view in some quarters that government is the root of America's ills, and the opposing view, which you can find on both the left and the right, that the government needs constantly to expand its role, to be equally suspect points of view. Rather, I would argue that public-private partnership has been the key to many of this country's greatest achievements, serving as the arsenal of diplomacy from World War II through to the defense of Ukraine, reaching the moon and exploring the planets, combating pandemic disease. And I will let Mr. Jefferson make my final point through this quotation from his second inaugural address. We are firmly convinced, and we act on that conviction, that with nations as with individuals, our interests, soundly calculated, will ever be found inseparable from our moral duties. Thank you.
If there were ever a profession of faith, it was that our moral duties and our interests would always run together. Would that it were so, although it's not always been my experience. But I think hopefully we've tantalized you a bit with some of the complexities of this business of democracy and diplomacy. I don't think you will find that we're going to solve anything. After all, these things have been around really since the beginning of the Republic. People love to quote the statement of Adams about not going abroad in search of monsters to destroy, but they often forget that what he was resisting was the notion that we should be engaging in supporting revolutionary movements in Latin America against colonial powers. And since we have that question continues to reverberate 200 years later, I think it's safe to say that we will not immediately wind it up. So over to you for questions if we've provoked any, and we'll have a microphone or two. And we may have just stunned you into silence, but I see one over here.
Thank you. My question is for Ambassador Nesbitt. I'm curious if there was any negative consequences from the embassy's stand for the president, and also how lasting was the goodwill from the Malagasy people after that time?
On the first question, I would say that there were, there's always positive and negative. I don't recall that there was anything overwhelmingly negative. I do recall that there is always a certain faction or a certain element on the domestic side that likes the status quo, and people are comfortable with the status quo, and that any kind of change needs to be, the assumption is that change is bad rather than that change is good. So that was generally what we tended to run into, was what's wrong with just staying where we are? And that's why it took many months of back and forth, almost daily discussions, and reports and sending data, et cetera, et cetera. That's why it took a long time. In terms of the lasting effect, I would say that certainly through the president's tenure, we had very goodwill from the Malagasy people. But I've had people who serve in, who've served in Madagascar stop by from time to see me to say, people still talk about how much it meant to them that the Americans were with us during this crisis in our history. So on the part of the people, if not on the part of the government, I think the people who lived through that still feel very positively towards the United States.
I don't know where Sienna is, but I was told we should ask if we're getting any questions from the live stream.
She is outside the room, but so far she has not received any questions.
Okay.
So you've talked about the process of democracy, and it takes a long time. There just doesn't seem to be a lot of support for that idea by the American public. So how do we try to change the American public's view that diplomacy takes time, that democracy building takes time, and that we should be more patient?
Wow. Happy to pass to my colleagues, though I haven't thought of two of my own.
Well, I think that's an important point, and I think we sometimes have to accept the reality of the, I don't mean this to sound pejorative, the limited attention span of the American people before we undertake these foreign adventures. And some of us on this panel spent time serving in Afghanistan. Ron was ambassador to Afghanistan. And I can remember times when congressional delegations would come to visit the embassy in Kabul and have joint sessions with the military leadership and the civilian leadership, and we talk about how long it was going to take to stabilize Afghanistan, build democracy, women's rights, and so on. And we were always, when we're being honest, talking in terms of decades. And they would say, okay, well, you're not going to have decades. The American people will not stand for that. What can you do in a much shorter time frame? And people were very reluctant to acknowledge that this isn't going to work. Maybe we should reconsider our goals. I could say the same thing about Vietnam. We go on and on about this. But I think the obverse of that is that political leaders, foreign policy leaders, sometimes take it for granted that involvement in the world is good for America, and we don't do enough of a job of persuading the ordinary citizen of why global trade and stability in places on the other side of the world is important to us. So, there needs to be a dialogue between people who do foreign affairs for a living and political leadership and ordinary citizens.
There are two things I think I would note. One is a great deal of responsibility falls on our political leadership, starting with the president. They have to own a war or a policy, and they have to explain it. That has not always happened. Certainly in the case of Afghanistan, whether you think it was the right thing or wrong thing, but after George W. Bush, the president did not own the war. The president made decisions to send thousands of troops in the case of Obama, but he gave a single speech. It was not a matter of convincing the American people or explaining the complexities of the situation. I don't know how much of it can be done, but I know a lot more could be tried. The second thing is I think we sometimes exaggerate the patience of the American people. In the case of Vietnam, American people were fed up, and they cut the legs out from under the negotiators and the administration by Congress cutting off the money. In Afghanistan, whether you think we should have gone or not, there was no comparable public pressure. There was no movement in Congress to cut off money. There was a lot of grumbling, but there was no particular pressure. The other thing is when the butcher's bill goes down, the public focus goes down. So when we were losing a lot of people in Iraq, you had a lot of discussion. But 2009, 10, we had 100,000 troops in Iraq. and you could hardly find an article on, till you got into the interior sections of the newspaper, because we weren't losing people anymore. So there's a dynamic here. If things go well or they get more peaceful, you've probably got more time politically. If they go bad, your political time shortens. But so often the discussion in Washington is, well, how many years can you keep this up, as though this is like a river going to a waterfall. It's a finite moment, you're going to reach it and crash. And in fact, it's a dynamic process in which, depending on what happens, you can expand the time frame, you can contract, but then it's up to the president to use that. It's also up to the president to choose realistic goals. The time frame chosen by President Obama for achieving his policy was grossly unrealistic. And President Trump had, two totally different policies during his administration. Started off a lot of violence and force, and then we were into a peace negotiation that he was insisting be rushed. And then you had President Biden, who probably had made up his decision, I think, in 2009 and never changed it. We had a completely farcical process of consultation with allies, after which we proceeded to ignore their views. That doesn't make the decision right or wrong. But in answer to your question, to the extent you can have the understanding of the American people, the American political leadership has to own the crisis and take that ownership and explain it.
Could I take a different point of view?
Yeah, of course.
I think
We'll even let you come
Washington has increasingly become isolated from the American people. And it has been a conscious effort by Washington to do that. For the Vietnam War, what brought the people into the streets? The draft. Everybody was affected by it, and they, when it became, your neighbors were getting drafted and killed in Vietnam, that became an issue. And the other thing, we actually paid for it. Today, we do neither. We have neither. So therefore, the two pressures on the government aren't there. So therefore, we tend to ignore the people because they don't get out in the street, but that doesn't mean they don't care about it. Secondly, we don't even care as much today about our allies participating with us as they did before. The difference between the Gulf War in 1991 was President Bush, that President Bush, and James Baker spent a tremendous amount of time building a large coalition together to support that operation. That was difficult because what happened then is if you have coalition partners, you actually have to listen to them. And therefore, they become a brake on what you can do. When the Iraq War started, that George Bush and his Secretary of State did not want partners because they didn't want to have their policy restricted. And so therefore, they could act without the constraint of the American people and without the constraint of allies. And I think that attitude in Washington has distanced us. I'm a creature of the swamp of Washington, please understand. I've been there for 50 years, and I enjoy it, and my whole life has been there. But I'm a realist about we do not care as much about the views of the American people. And we're shocked that they don't support what we don't believe what they're telling us. How could they not believe us? We're such great people.
More. Yes, got a couple over here.
So this was kind of first touched on in Ambassador Newman's introduction, but I think all of you have hit on some form of this, that it's the sense of futility to think that elections are the only thing you need for kind of a stable democratic society, and this idea that you need to do some kind of building of a political culture before you proceed to this process of elections. What steps can the United States take or recommend that other countries take to actually build up this political culture? And more significantly, kind of who decides when it is time?
I've got one thought, but I'm prepared to let others lead here.
I'll take a crack. I'll make a quick comment on that because I don't have a full answer for you. But one of the things that I found was more effective than putting an emphasis on elections was putting an emphasis, which we did quite often, on quote-unquote good governance. The reason being that I've served mostly in the developing world and what people used to call third world countries. But many times, political parties are meaningless in some countries. And so to have an election, it's basically about individuals, not about parties or ideology. And what is far more meaningful is to try and have civil society look at what is the government doing for the people of that country? Is it doing what the people want? And if it's not, what changes need to be made? And so I think from a long-term perspective, it's far more effective to try and look at whether there are institutions, whether the health system works, whether the education system works and is actually delivering anything to people, rather than how many elections they've held.
I would add, just when we speak just about elections, there's more to elections than what happens on election day, because an authoritarian government can do a lot to unbalance the playing field, to control the media so alternative voices are not heard, to work the judicial system, even to make sure that if there's a so-called independent electoral commission that is, monitoring the counting of the votes, that they're in the tank for the government. So, I mean, I've served in a country where on election day, things pretty much went the way they were supposed to. The ballots go in the box, the ballots get counted, but that election had been completely twisted for years in advance before election day. And let's be frank, you hear similar accusations in the United States, where legislatures, sometimes with judicial support, can be working through gerrymandering and changes to electoral laws to make sure that what happens on election day is not what some truly independent observer, a Martian sociologist, would call a fair election.
I think another thing which we don't talk about enough in America, we don't talk enough about it in the study of democracy, is minority rights. This goes back to the business of communities voting as communities that Graeme talked about. Because democracy will only work if there's a general respect for the rules. And that means that losers have to see that they have the possibility of becoming winners.
Right.
If losers are permanent losers, they have no reason to respect the rules. And then you're on the way to coups and revolutions. And so I think we get very carried away with, there ought to be complete democracy. If democracy means 51% of the people can do any damn thing they want for the other 49%, which I think is actually not what Jefferson said, then that 49% has no reason to respect those rules unless they think that they can become a majority. But when people vote by communities, this was a problem in Iraq. The Shia are a much larger community than the Sunnis. If you don't, and the Kurds as well. So if the Sunnis don't feel that the system is going to protect them, there's no reason for them to respect the system. And I don't think we've understood that very well in the United States. I don't think we educate people very well to understand the relative balancing of minority rights with majority rights. And so that starts with us and with the systems we help others design and what we say should be respected.
I think that's also partly because we don't have full discussions anymore about an issue before we do something. We truncate the conversation. And I think anyone who had studied Iraq before the Iraq War would have realized that if you went to one man, one vote in Iraq, the winner was going to be Iran because of the Shia conflict. Anybody knew that. And the question is, how do you protect everybody's rights so all the communities are taken care of? And that should have been thought of before we got there. In addition, I think the people who were there made some unforced errors.
Oh, a few.
I mean, I'll give you an example. When Douglas MacArthur reconquered the Philippines, Harold Ickes, the Secretary of Interior, thought he should take over the Philippines because it was part of the internal of the United States. It was an Interior Department thing and not MacArthur. In addition, Ickes wanted to say that any Filipino who participated in the Japanese occupation government could not be in the government. MacArthur, who had lived in the Philippines, he spent time in the Philippines, says, no, you can't do that. I'm going to take over, not you. Of course, he was a guy with the troops on the ground, so he prevailed. Yeah, but he said, if you take those people out of the equation, we will not be able to govern. There'll be no governing class in the Philippines. If the guys in Iraq, after our invasion, had listened to General MacArthur, they would not have done some of the things they did.
Yes.
Speaking as a couple of the guys in Iraq, we agree with you, okay? That the de-Baathification program went way too far, I mean, as you say. And also, initially there was a plan to use the Iraqi military to help rebuild the country. And there were people in Washington who said, well, we eviscerated the Iraqi military. There is no Iraqi military. Where some of us thought, well, all we have to do is put out words saying, if you show up on Tuesday at the big smoking hole that used to be your barracks, we will pay you, to do public works projects and defend your country. Yeah, lots of missed opportunities.
Another one.
Hi, you guys are obviously very seasoned in foreign service, and you guys have been through a lot of different administrations. What are some of the challenges you think of facing transitioning administrations at presidential level? And how have you guys overcome those challenges?
Well, I don't understand the question. Say this again. I'm not sure we got the question.
How have you guys faced challenges in changing different presidents, like maybe going from a Democrat to a Republican, or Republican to Democrat, and have you guys overcome those challenges?
Well, the basic mission is to carry out the orders of the elected officials. And that's a message that I say we, I'm not in anymore, professional to form it, but it's a message that diplomats carry to each administration, which each administration only half believes. That your mission is to carry out the decisions of the elected leadership. And if that changes and they change policies, carry out the new policies. Or you can leave. And you can argue for why you ought to carry out a different policy, but if you lose the argument, you go ahead. Now, what you find when administrations change is there tends to be a distrust of senior officials from the last administration, whether or not they were career or political. And that has been sometimes extreme. Well, in that case, it's time to look for, it's time to check out your pension status and look for a new job. But basically, this falls much more on people in Washington than it does people in the field. Yeah. With the exception of political ambassadors. When a new administration comes into office, everybody in presidential appointed positions, those that are confirmed by the Senate, submits a letter of resignation. And generally what happens is that the political appointees of the previous administration find their letters accepted, and the career people soldier on, with some exceptions, particularly if there's a policy that is, has been grossly fought over, and the people in the outgoing administration are very much seen as part, and may well be truthfully seen as backers of a policy, then they'll probably be asked to leave as well. Most of your career ambassadors will stay in place. But then we now have a new problem, which is the incredible amount of time it takes to get people confirmed, so that you go a very long period with almost no government. And no ambassadors some places, and we have very good chargés. Phil was acting ambassador in Turkey, but chargés, by and large, are not going to have quite the same access as a presidentially appointed ambassador. They're not going to be seen as speaking with exactly the same authority. And so the fact that we are slower and slower and slower year on year in appointing and then confirming people is a real problem. It's been a real problem in this administration, and it's a twofold problem. On the one hand, the Biden administration has been about as slow as molasses running in January in getting a lot of these appointments made, and then the Congress has been the Senate has been extremely slow about confirming them. Fortunately, a slug of career appointees just got confirmed, but it can be, you know, we've had people that have waited 2 years for confirmation.
Yeah.
Actually, I think we've had some that have waited longer. So that is not quite a high mark of American diplomacy or American politics.
May I make a comment too?
Yeah, of course.
I may have a different perspective than most, because I was fired once for being a Democrat and twice for being a Republican. And I used to think that the only thing they could agree on was firing me. But I think the problem's worse. I think that the worst in Washington, worse than what Ron talks about.
That's not a disagreement.
What's happened is, in my lifetime in Washington, transitions in the past at the administration level were relatively smooth. There's certain people in the new, you know, for example, I worked on Middle East issues in 1976. We, as State Department grunts, we put together volumes, 3 volumes on Middle East peace, West Bank, Gaza, Golan Heights. We said, no matter who's president, they will address this issue. It didn't make one because it was in the national interest. In addition, people who came in at that time, if the administration wanted to do something and there was a crisis and they had to make a decision, they would confer with the incoming administration. There was a sort of understanding that you turned it over. I see recently administrations make policy decisions that are in those last 2 months between the election and the turnover of power, designed to foreclose opportunities to the incoming administration rather than cooperating. This can only get worse over time. And it's done by both sides. And I think that sort of consensus is trying to say what matters is that we have a government that functions smoothly is being lost. And it doesn't make any difference who wins.
I have to say, I agree completely with that. I recall, it used to be, and it still is to a certain degree the case, that if you have a transition from a Democrat to a Democrat or a Republican, if you're with the same political party, the changes are not did not used to be that massive. And particularly when it came to foreign policy, there used to be far more of a consensus than there is today about kind of what the big threats are, what the big issues are. But I agree that I have seen it in recent years, almost a mindset of whatever they did is wrong and we have to change it. And I think that's extremely unfortunate on both sides.
We've got one here. At least we haven't worn you out yet. Okay.
Yeah, so over the courses of your career, have you all become more optimistic that the United States will remain like the leader of democracy, or have you become like more cynical that the United States could backslide into tyranny and instability like the nations that you guys have served in?
Wow.
Do you want our answer for the time we're sitting alone at our desk at home or when we're speaking in public?
Yeah, the real answer.
Yeah.
I suppose that I am more worried, I'm more concerned. I wouldn't say I'm pessimistic necessarily. I mean, first of all, optimism is a professional requirement in our career. We deal so often with problems that are so intractable that if you don't sort of approach things with a sense you can get things done, you'd be in terrible shape. And it's useful to look at history, and it's not a guarantee, but it reminds you that a lot of things that are happening now have happened before. We have vilified our leaders at least as much as we are vilifying them now. I mean, Tyson's book is full of claims of leaders being traitors and in the pay of foreign nations. Sounds just like today. Now, that doesn't mean that you'll come out of it whole, but it does, you know, I worry, but I wouldn't say I'm pessimistic, because there's still, you know, you've been here before and you've survived, and you might do it again. And there's a basic faith, I think, although it's a little tenuous some days, but if you really believe in democracy, you've really got to hang on to the idea that we've got to have an election and we've got to live with the results of that election, whatever they are. And then, you know, cross your fingers and hope. Colleagues, optimist, pessimist?
Hope is not a plan, though, right? I mean, the people, and especially the people in this room, young people, need to be out there, you know, not just at their keyboards, but out there in their communities protecting democracy. All right? I have great faith in this generation, and I have great optimism for the future of American democracy, but it ain't going to protect itself.
I would just add that I'm not pessimistic at all, but I do worry that we're coming to a point where, because we have the freedom to say whatever we want, and we have the freedom to say it on social media and all of the things that go with technology, that we're losing a sense of what responsibility means. And I think that's a little bit worrisome. But I'm not pessimistic, because I think, by and large, you know, the vast majority of people are reasonable, sensible people who want the country to work well and will make good decisions.
Oh, can I finish can I say something
Yeah.
here? I'm actually a little more pessimistic. I'm optimistic when I go to Capitol Hill and spend a lot of time with young staffers. And when I leave those people, I'm very optimistic. They're good people, they're smart people, they're working for the well-being of the country. But when I see the upper levels of decision makers in this country and the leadership we're getting, I worry, because our dominant position is no longer there, and we're not displaying the energy and the ability to reform ourselves that was our strength. Our strength as a country was our ability to adapt and change with time, and we seem to have been losing that ability in recent years politically, and I worry about that. We can recuperate it. I still think we have all the potential to do it, but I don't see the people leading us in that direction.
Sienna, did you have one online?
This is a question from a student online. They want to know what exactly observing elections entails. For example, Graeme, you are partnered with the Venezuelan, and are there, what are the internal politics? Are there foreign observers in our U.S. elections?
Oh, good question.
Of course not. Why would we let somebody interfere with our elections? That is one of the problems we have. People will say, a perfect example is I was an election observer in the Georgian elections in 1991 when Georgia, everybody was excited because this is the first election. They weren't part of the Soviet Union. This is the first time they were going to do it. And I was paired up with a German guy, and we started down in Kutaisi, which is the second largest city right near the Black Sea, the palm trees and all of that. And we went with you had a few problems with a lot of guys with guns, but that's a different issue. But anyhow, we wandered up. By the end of the day, I was up in the mountains, 5,000 feet, 6 inches of snow in my loafers. It was great. And anyhow, no one had asked me a single question. When you're an election observer, you're there, and people usually come up and ask you a question about something. Finally, this guy comes up to me and asks a question. And what he said to me was, "Can I ask any question?" I said, "Absolutely, anything you want." He said, "Did Senator Kennedy really cheat on his exams at Harvard?" what he was doing was he was saying to me in a circuitous way, why are you here and judging us? You have your problems. We have to be careful about that. We have to think about these things. And you know, that's why when Ron says we have to be more sensitive to others, we need to listen better as a country. And as a people, if we listen to each other better, we'd all be better off.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the mechanisms of being an observer? Because I think that was part
Okay,
of
the
the
mechanism for being an observer? Okay. Fortunately, the guys like NDI and IRI, they've got this down to a science. When you're an observer like me, I come, I join. But they've been there before for months, working with people. They have detailed books about the history, the culture, and they fill you in. And if you're a good observer, you go in and you look and you say, you don't comment. You don't try to tell them what to do. However, some people can't restrain themselves. Being good Americans, we give our opinions. But it's very interesting. I mean, and you know, there are times when you know things are bad. I mean, in the Philippines, the Marcos Aquino election, I was with Senator Kerry then. We were going in at night where they were collecting the ballot boxes, and 3 guys came running past us with ballot boxes in their hands, and we knew that was a bad sign. But on the whole, you know when things are going bad, and you're just there and you're observing, and hopefully what you can do and say, well, you could do this a little better. You really shouldn't have the local constable going into the voting booth with the guy. It may influence his vote and things like that. You can make suggestions like that. And I think on the whole, you're being there, but you're not doing it yourself. The best places are where there's a whole local observer network and you're supporting those people in the process. It's not you doing it yourself as the outsider. You're supporting people in the country.
Do we have time for one?
Yeah.
Sitting here in Mr. Jefferson's backyard, I have to mention the word education. I think his education plan was both moral, civic, and social. And I think we can't assume we can get a better educated citizenry without a better education system. So that's got to be a dimension for the future. If we can break this cycle that we've been talking about here for 200 or 300 years or more, we've got to finally get to education that's going to give us the tools from which we become better citizens, ask better questions, and make better decisions. So,
I totally agree.
Yeah.
And,
Yep.
I think just basic civic education to where people, not all the young people, simply understand enough about the budgetary process, for instance, to understand why something doesn't get done. You may not like it, but you need to understand. Otherwise, you blame it. If you don't understand the mechanisms, you tend to blame hypocrisy, criminality, you know, all kinds of things for some problem, some of which, you know, may have some of that. But a lot of times it's the grinding of the system and people not compromising and the rules of the system. You need to at least understand the rules. So I agree totally with you. We're pretty close on time. We got any more? Yep, we got one.
Hello. What is the impression on the world or the thoughts of the world on the growing rise of not only the rise of isolationism within the United States, the return to isolationism, but something kind of a little bit, something I've felt in my family as a military family, the growing divide between the military community and the non-military community and understanding one another.
That's because no draft.
Yes. I mean, that divide is there. Fewer and fewer people are serving in the military, and that does cut us off. I remember 1969, we'd been at war in Vietnam for quite a while. I had one kid in my rifle platoon telling me that his family had never had a view about the war until he was drafted. Yep. You know, until it touches people, they don't have a view. Now, I don't think we can get back to the draft, but we're going to have to think about this. No. Other countries, I think you have very disparate views because you have countries that are more autocratic. They're perfectly, you know, there are a number of countries out there that are perfectly happy with the way we're going. And would like to see us return to the way we were in the last administration. And there are others that are terribly worried about this. So you can't really, you'd have to go country by country. Couldn't generalize about it. I think we can do one more question if we have one more.
Good. Can I say something about that?
Yeah, of course.
I think what you get on about being isolated is a great concern in any democracy. When the military feels isolated from the population as a whole, and the population as a whole feels isolated from the military. And I think that is one of the consequences of getting rid of the draft. You know, that has broken down the ties between the military and the American people. Among my military friends of my generation, almost to a man believes the elimination of the draft has been detrimental for the military and its relationship with the American people.
Do we have any more? Then, got one.
It was said earlier that Americans tend to think the rest of the world thinks like we do. And I'm curious how, as a diplomat, we balance understanding other cultures and ethnicities with our own objectives and agendas, and how we kind of marry those two and what skills are needed to accomplish that.
Well, the ability to listen is very important. Yeah, one book I would recommend that's very common in colleges, some of you may be familiar with it, is Getting to Yes by Roger Fisher, which is a classic book about negotiation, which starts with trying to understand the perspective and the goals of the people sitting across the table, whether it's, you know, diplomacy or business or, you know, your family you could be negotiating. I think as American diplomats, we don't always listen as well as we should. We don't always persuade as well as we should. And I will go farther and say, and I may get thrown out of the academy for saying this, Ron, but the best diplomats I've known over the years are not American, because as talented and experienced as American diplomats are, we have certain tools at our disposal that other diplomats don't have. We can offer economic assistance or threaten economic sanctions. We can offer security assistance or threaten, you know, hellfire and damnation. A lot of countries don't have the ability to do that, so their diplomats have to have a deep knowledge of history and powers of persuasion to get their jobs done. And I think we could learn a lot from other countries' diplomats.
Listening is a key part of diplomacy, but I think overall, diplomats do it reasonably well, but then you have to explain it to Washington. And yeah, I've often joked that the second hardest job of the ambassador is understanding the country you're in, and the hardest job is explaining it to Washington. In large part because Washington doesn't really care. They just want you to do it our way. So finding a way to listen, that's important. Finding a way to explain it in a way that is acceptable in Washington, not necessarily that they like it, but that they at least accept where you have basic constraints of things you can't do. That is one of the huge challenges of American diplomats, but particularly those assigned to Washington. Well, I thank you for this, you know, great set of questions and for sticking with us. And I think we're going to go on, we're going to go directly to our colleague, Tom Shannon, I believe. So thank you to my colleagues on the panel.
Thank you.
This has been a lot of fun. And I'm going to introduce Tom and then get off the stage. But you're very lucky to have Ambassador Tom Shannon for our wind-up speaker here. Tom is a career ambassador. That's the highest rank we have in our diplomacy, and we don't have very many of them. He has been Undersecretary of State. He's been acting Secretary of State between administrations. That's the only way a career officer ever gets to be Secretary of State. He has been ambassador to Brazil. He's been Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs. But I think beyond that, he has a reflective intellect that has made him a particularly valuable interlocutor. So, Tom, over to you.
Well, good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here. Looking out on a beautiful day, I kind of wonder why we are sitting inside and not sitting outside. But it's been a fantastic afternoon listening to a wonderful set of speakers who have been able to take us on a democratic journey, beginning in the early 19th century and then traveling through the modern challenges that American diplomacy has faced as it has attempted to bring the democratic purpose and values of the United States to bear in the world, with some success and some failure, but highlighting the challenges that American diplomats face on a day-to-day basis as they try to look for ways to help countries manage political transition and economic and social transition. You know, for those of you who are students, for those of you who are considering a future in public service, the U.S. Foreign Service and the larger field of national security professionals remains an exciting and dynamic area. I was a Foreign Service officer for 35 years, serving mostly in Latin America and Africa. And for me, it was a joyful career. It's one that I enjoyed even in its most difficult and challenging of moments. But it's also one that was humbling, it's some days humiliating, depending on events. But I start with this because as I think back on my career as an American diplomat, I would have been called a dusty roads diplomat because I spent all of my time in countries which today would be called the Global South. In my days, it was called the developing world in Latin America and Africa, who were in the midst of really significant transitions, political transitions from mostly authoritarian and military governments to popularly elected and democratic governments, transitions from really internal import substitution-based models of development to understanding of development as being driven by trade and regional economic integration, from closed economies to open economies, and from closed societies to open societies, and a clear recognition that societies benefit from becoming inclusive and trying to bring more voices into determining national purpose and destiny. And in the process of this, I realized that the United States and the power of the United States can be used for great good if it is handled well, and it is handled with determined purpose. And it convinced me that my career as a diplomat not only allowed me to advance American interests and promote American values, but in the process, identify and work with partners and allies around the world who saw things the way we did and wanted to find ways to put their countries and their societies into the world in a way that had a positive impact. And so I would certainly urge those of you who are looking for a way to lead significant lives of real consequence, to look at what the U.S. Foreign Service and the larger groupings of civil service jobs that are related to being national security professionals offer. You know, I began my career in Guatemala in the 1980s and experienced there the transition in Guatemala from military government to civilian and democratically elected government. I then moved on to Brazil, where I arrived there in 1989. In 1988, the military government had handed over power to a selected civilian government, and in 1990, Brazil had its first popularly elected president since 1964. And then I went on to South Africa, to Johannesburg, and I was present for the election of Nelson Mandela and for the first year of his presidency. And then I moved on to Caracas, Venezuela, and was there for the election of Hugo Chavez. And in each instance, countries had constituent assemblies. They were completely restructuring and rebuilding their political framework, trying to democratize it. And in each instance, they were either for the first or the second time electing leaders from a popular base. And for me, this was exciting, it was dramatic, and it was something that convinced me that democracy was an important part of American diplomacy. I then returned back to Washington to work first in the National Security Council during the presidency of Bill Clinton. And then I moved over from there to the Organization of American States, where I was part of the U.S. permanent delegation or mission to the Organization of American States, and I was working as the deputy permanent representative, or the number 2 in that office. And this was a striking moment because this was the beginning of the 21st century, and the push for democracy, especially in the Western Hemisphere, in the countries of South America, Central America, and the Caribbean, we had seen this impressive democratization take place, in which countries had thrown aside military governments and authoritarian governments and were electing new governments. And the region was looking for a way to codify this change and looking for a way to establish processes and procedures that were going to allow democracy to root itself and be successful in our hemisphere. And at the end of the Clinton administration, the OAS, the Organization of American States, was facing a very significant challenge in Peru, where then President Alberto Fujimori had effectively intervened in electoral processes to ensure his re-election during an electoral campaign against a very determined opponent, a gentleman by the name of Alejandro Toledo. And Toledo, in the midst of a campaign, pulled out of a campaign, insisted that President Fujimori and his government had collapsed the fundamental basis for a free and fair election, and demanded regional action through the Organization of American States. The Organization of American States every year holds a General Assembly in different parts of the hemisphere, and that year it was held in Windsor, Canada. So the Canadians were overseeing the process. And as they did so, they set in motion a series of political moves which led to a resolution that then led to internal dialogue in Peru that effectively created a space to collapse the anti-democratic maneuvers of the Fujimori government, open a political opportunity for the Peruvian people to really participate in a free and fair election, and to elect Alejandro Toledo as president. It was a remarkable moment of regional solidarity behind the democratic intent and purpose of the Peruvian people as opposed to its own government, and that opened up a space for and highlighted the importance of electoral observation and having validators who could help convince the people who were voting that their votes would be counted and their votes would be meaningful. And this led the Clinton administration to focus on how to put what had been learned in Peru into some kind of juridical and diplomatic framework that could be used elsewhere. And they began working on within the OAS and within the Clinton administration, we began working on language that would then be inserted into the Summit of the Americas document that would be used in the next administration, in other words, in the Bush administration, that would require all countries participating in the Summit of the Americas to be democratic, and that any rupture in constitutional order or democratic process would lead to these countries no longer being considered eligible to participate in the summit. And at that summit in Canada, in Ottawa, I'm sorry, it was in Quebec City. At the Quebec City summit, which was President Bush's first summit, the democracy clause, or a clause that insisted that to participate in the summit you had to be a democratic and constitutionally ordered government, was adopted by all of the leaders present. And at the same time, they looked for a way to insert that language into the Organization of American States, the organization that represents all of the countries at that time, with the exception of Cuba, in the Western Hemisphere. The reason I'm kind of walking through this quick diplomatic history is that those series of steps, the events in Peru, the effort by the Clinton administration at the end of its presidency to shape and fashion a diplomatic initiative that would carry on, not only into another presidency, but into a Republican presidency, the willingness of that Republican presidency to embrace the Clinton initiative, to make it a central part of how the United States engaged in the Summit of the Americas, was an important example of continuity in American policy and approach on democracy. But as we, and I participated in the both in the Windsor Summit when I was at the National Security Council, and then I participated in the Quebec City Summit as a member of the Organization of American States and part of the planning team and the negotiating team around the summit documents. It created a space for us to bring all the countries of the region together and have a larger negotiation about how you define democracy, how you define the structures that are necessary for democracy, how you create ways in which the region can work together to preserve constitutional order and preserve that democratic process. And this began negotiations in the immediate aftermath. This is 2001, before many of you were born, create a process that would lead to a political agreement within the Organization of American States about how to define and promote democracy. And negotiations were done, the Quebec City Summit was in April, negotiations were done through May, and then in early June, a draft document was presented at the OAS General Assembly in San Jose, Costa Rica. It was voted down at that moment because of disagreements between and among the Caribbean countries who did not think that aspects of the agreement, it was called the Inter-American Democratic Charter, had sufficiently taken into account the concerns of small island nations in the Caribbean. And so we had to return to the negotiating room and work through these problems and differences, which we did through that summer. And then on September 11th, 2001, in Lima, Peru, as the first plane was slamming into the World Trade Center in New York City, and as the second plane was already in the air, Secretary of State Colin Powell was having breakfast with President Alejandro Toledo in Lima, and we were about to go to the OAS Special General Assembly to consider the Inter-American Democratic Charter. And at that, as the breakfast was ending, the second plane hit the World Trade Center. It collapsed, and Secretary Powell turned to us and said, "We are at war. Let's get our plane ready. But before I return to Washington, I'm going to the Special General Assembly, and I'm going to approve with my colleagues the Inter-American Democratic Charter," which is what he did, calling upon all the countries present to provide their unanimous support for the Inter-American Democratic Charter as the best and only response to a terrorist attack, which was a terrorist attack not only on the United States, but in the words of Secretary Powell, on all democratic nations and all open societies. And what was important about this Inter-American Democratic Charter is that at the very opening of the substantive part of the charter, it described democracy as a right of all the peoples of the Americas. Now, for those of you who have thought about and read about democracy, the tendency is to understand democracy as either an accumulation of fundamental freedoms and liberties, like freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of belief, or as a political structure that allows people to, through their vote, to express political will in determining who will represent them and what direction their country will take. Democracy had never been defined as a fundamental right itself. And this was a philosophical and a political breakthrough which represented the way in which the countries of our own hemisphere understood democracy, especially in their effort to push back against authoritarian and military governments. But maybe most importantly, well, two things most importantly. The opening clause says that democracy is the right of all the peoples of the Americas. It also says the nations of the Americas, or the governments of the Americas, have an obligation to promote and defend it. In other words, it's not only a right that people can assert, it is an obligation that governments have to stand up to. But then the second clause says that democracy is fundamental to the political, economic, and social development of the peoples of the Americas. And this second clause is important because this is a region that historically has been defined by poverty, inequality, and social exclusion. And for a region to find itself in this kind of development conundrum and assert that democracy is necessary for it to develop is a profound statement. Because what it means is that democracy is not something that comes to you at the end of a process of development. It's not something that comes to you after you've hit a certain GDP level. It's not something that comes to you after you reach a certain education level. It's a right that is available to you at every moment and that is necessary for the right kind of political development to take place in a country. And this is a very Western Hemisphere statement. I'm not sure this is a statement you would have heard in Iraq or Afghanistan, but throughout the Western Hemisphere, because of the nature of their political development, you would have heard this. And it means that these are countries that had experienced efforts at development through military governments, through communist governments, through other kinds of authoritarian governments, and they had never been able to address the fundamental social inequalities and inequities of the societies in which they lived. And therefore, they were committing themselves to democracy at a historical moment and with the support of the United States. And what's striking and important about this, in my view, is that the countries of the Western Hemisphere, the United States included, were saying that democracy is more than elections, as important as elections are, and it is more than governmental structure and constitutional order, as important as those are. Because it was arguing that at the end of the day, democratic governance is not about building a democratic state. It's about building a democratic society. It's about ensuring that people not only have a voice in determining their national destiny, but they have a voice in determining their individual destiny, which means they have a right not just to vote, but they have a right to education, they have a right to health care, they have a right to security, they have a right to social justice. They have a right to the circumstances that they need to fulfill themselves as individuals. In other words, to obtain what our founding fathers called the pursuit of happiness. And for me, this was a profound moment, but it was also part of a more profound process for the United States. Because what this does is it opens a doorway for us to engage with countries that are in moments of profound transition and let them know that democracy is not a status quo political system. It's not about protecting or preserving a moment in time. It's about creating social transformation. You could call it social revolution if you want, but within a peaceful constitutional construct, and that this can be done. And this brings me to the larger question that we have been wrestling with today, which is how do you make democracy real in a world? And what can the United States be doing in its diplomacy to work in this kind of environment on behalf of people who are trying to generate this kind of social transformation? And I think how we address this and understand it is meaningful, because if you look into the Western Hemisphere, with all the challenges that it has faced, democracy has achieved meaningful results. And it has done so in a fairly short period of time, and it has done so in ways that I think, are useful for other parts of the world who are struggling with the same kinds of challenges that countries of the Western Hemisphere have faced over these many decades, even centuries. And as we think about the world we live in today, and as we think about the kinds of challenges that especially all of you who are students are going to face, think about this. We're in the midst of a period of time where social and economic change, accelerated through technology, has just blown past our political institutions. It's blown past our political leadership. It's overwhelmed their ability to explain what's going on, to help you understand what's going on, and to respond to what's going on. And this is why we see, not only in democratic nations, but also in authoritarian nations, a deep decline in confidence and trust in government, a deep decline in confidence and trust in political parties, and a turn to political leadership which offers either comfort or answers. They don't necessarily make them real, but they offer them. And I would argue that, and this is picking up on something that Ambassador Nesbitt said, that in many ways the kind of challenges that our democracy faces today are not fundamentally democratic challenges, they're problems of governance. And they're problems of an ability of our democratic processes and institutions to deliver the goods, to provide for people what the people believe they need, and in many instances have a right to, in order to advance themselves as individuals in the kind of society they want to live in. And what I think this does for the United States, as we look at our diplomacy in the rest of the 21st century, is that we need to focus more on helping our partners and our allies deliver the goods. We need to look for ways to help our partners and allies show that the kinds of democratic structures and constitutional order that we have been working with over time can indeed respond to the world around us. But it requires a degree of creativity in how we understand those institutions, how we understand our parties, and a willingness in some instances to step beyond what we would consider to be established orders and be prepared to experiment with new models of democratic participation and especially democratic governance. And this brings me to another point. Graeme Bannerman had mentioned at the beginning the different structures that were created in the 1980s here in the United States to begin to promote a larger democratic agenda. The two political parties, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, each got their own institutes, the International Republican Institute and the National Democratic Institute. The trade unions got their bit of the pie, and we worked in ways to focus on building parties, building communication capacity, all of which was important. But over time, increasingly, there has been a focus on building civil society capacity and addressing questions of transparency and corruption, all important. However, there has not been an equal focus on institutional capacity and institutional development and how state institutions need to be able to connect to a larger civil society if they're going to be able to provide what in each of these countries people are demanding or asking for. And I think that increasingly, as we look into the world and try to understand how we are going to work with our democratic partners to address the challenges they face, that as important as it is to work beyond the realms of state institutions and government, that unless we work inside inside governments and inside state institutions, we're going to be chasing the wind and unsuccessfully so. And so I think we're in this remarkable moment where the world is being transformed around us, and where our understanding of what government is and what it can do is being transformed around us. But it's a moment of great opportunity, I believe, and I think it's ultimately a moment of hopefulness. Because in this environment where politics suddenly become fluid, suddenly become malleable, suddenly become something that you can shape and to advance an open society, to allow new voices to express themselves, to create new forms of empowerment, and to create an open society in which people can really live an authentic life, is profoundly attractive. And this is why, you know, when I think back on my time as an American diplomat and since, you know, there are kind of a couple of principles or rules that I think are necessary to shape and form American diplomacy that all relate back in one way or another to this larger issue of democracy. The first is that as we look out into the world and try to understand who's our friend and who's our foe, it's evident who our enemy is. Our enemy is the status quo. Our enemy is right now. Because anybody who thinks that you can either preserve the moment or restore the past is wrong. The United States has never been a status quo power. It has never tried to be a status quo power, but we're in danger of becoming one right now because we're afraid. We're afraid of other countries, other societies, other economies that might surpass us in some fashion. And I don't understand where the fear comes from. Because as a nation, we have always challenged the status quo. As a nation, whenever we have fought or whenever we have struggled, it has never been about holding the moment. It has always been about shaping the future. And so for all of you, your primary assignment is shape the future. Do not accept the status quo. The second point worth noting is that all politics are social. And what I mean by that is that in the kind of economy and society we live in, and with the kind of technology that we have today, increasingly what matters for people is inequality and lack of access and discontinuities between how technologies are available across a society and in a world. Imagine Africa right now. If you're in Central Africa, if you're looking around you and you're seeing governments that don't work, terrorism and transnational crime groups moving in, along with paramilitary groups, to control and run your society, and if you can't, through lack of connectivity, be part of a global economy, what are you going to do? You're going to leave. You're going to look for a better life. The same is true in Central America. Same is true in parts of the Middle East. And this kind of inequality is going to become a profound part of national politics and global politics. And we have to understand that at the end of the day, if we're going to be successful, we need to understand that politics need to address this social component. The third piece relates directly to the democracy piece, which is that values matter. And how countries project themselves at this moment in time is going to have a profound impact. And if we get trapped into a great power model of competition, we're in big trouble. Because the last time the world did that was in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and guess what? It didn't turn out too well. And what we need to know and understand is that the United States, as a nation that has put values into its foreign policy, that even when we don't live up to those values, even when we act counter to those values, the values are still real, and we can still be held to them, and we still have to look for ways to express them. But what these values mean is that they're about economic empowerment and individual empowerment and protection of the rights of individuals. And the extent to which we can continue to articulate that, it'll be good for us and it'll have an impact. The fourth kind of principle worth noting is that as important as nation states are, and as important as they are as building blocks of global governance, the reality is that societies and cultures are more important, and that the United States is uniquely positioned to take advantage of this expansive world because we have a society that is naturally expansive and that naturally connects to the rest of the world through our private sectors, through our universities, through our faith communities, through you name it. And we need to find ways to accelerate that, to deepen it, and to make it a significant part of how we understand the world. And to recognize that even with all the political change, that throughout the world there are cultural bases that we can connect to that are not going to be swept away by the Russians or anybody else. They're going to stay where they are. They're just going to go to ground. And we need to find ways to lift them up. And the final point that I'd like to make is that in the kind of world we're in right now, increasingly legitimacy is going to be determined by outcome and not by process. And this is challenging for Americans to think about because we live in a world where the legitimacy of our government is defined by a process and a constitutional order. And it's not that the process is not important. It's not that the order is not important. The constitutional order is not important. But what is important is, as I mentioned earlier, the ability to deliver the goods, the ability of government to show that it does things that are meaningful. It doesn't just take your money. It actually has a way of giving back in some meaningful fashion. And this is something that we have to build into our understanding of democracy and make part of our diplomacy if we are going to find a way to succeed in the 21st century. And, you know, in the, Tyson Reeder talked about the beginning of the 19th century and all the challenges faced in 1812. And this was a period of time in which American democracy was challenged by our own internal factionalism, but it was still being managed and run by a very small group of people. It was largely the landed aristocracy of Virginia and the who were enslavers, and the political aristocracy of Massachusetts, who were not enslavers. But this breaks in 1828 with Andrew Jackson. It breaks with America's first popular president, who was also an authoritarian. But guess what? That authoritarian sits in the middle of Lafayette Park in Washington, D.C., right in front of the White House. And Andrew Jackson was a complicated man with a complicated history. But if you read the historian Arthur Schlesinger's book about Andrew Jackson, The Age of Jackson, when Jackson is elected, Schlesinger writes, the young republic, in other words, the United States, faced a crucial test. Could it survive the rule of the people? Think about that for a minute. This is the United States of America. And yet we were wondering, would the republic survive the rule of the people? And what I would say to you is that democracy today faces the same test as the republic. Can it survive the rule of the people, the demands of the people? And I would argue that it can, but we just need to understand it differently, and we need to understand it in a way that allows us to use our great power and our great purpose to shape institutions and processes that in ways that benefit people. And you know, in the there's a certain fearfulness that has invaded American politics and American life, and it's curious because if you look back to the 1840s, the mid part of the 19th century, even as with all of the social and political tension, with all of the buildup to what becomes our Civil War, people understood the dangerous nature of the time, but at the same moment, it was a period of time in the United States where there was a sense of potentiality and an expectancy that things were going to be managed well. There was a purpose and a determination. And, you know, in some ways, the Americans of that period were not entirely focused on the risks that the American experiment presented, but they were very focused on what they could accomplish. And I would argue that in this moment, we need a similar sense of potentiality and expectancy. In other words, I believe that we are on actually the cusp of really profound changes in our society, in our economies, and through technology, we are at a moment in which we can radically improve the quality of lives for many, many people. But that we have to keep our peace within our nation and beyond our nation. And you know, Walt Whitman, the great poet of democracy, once wrote about the United States and our democracy. He said, "We have had man indoors and under artificial relations, man in war, man in love, man in courts, bowers, castles, and parlors. But never before have we had man in the open air. His attitude adjusted to the seasons, and as one might describe it, adjusted to the sun by day and the stars by night." What this great poet was trying to say is that democracy has a human face, and it lives in a human world, and that for the United States to be successful in our foreign policy, we need to find a way to express that in ways that resonate in other societies and then come back to us. So with that, thank you very much for your time. And I'm happy to take any questions or comments. I'm a pretty good catcher, so if you throw anything at me, I'm going to grab it.
Thanks so much. When we're talking about this kind of idea of failure to deliver the goods when it comes to democracy and good governance, I think obviously you've seen examples of this in Latin America, and we've seen how post the conflicts that arise from this failure, states rebuild and build new societies, constitutions, and good governance. I think there's also a sense that today, in some sense, American democracy fails to deliver the goods. What lessons specifically in kind of good governance and constitution building do you think we have to learn from these states who have gone through this whole process and seen the other side?
You know, that's a great question, because especially based on my experience in Latin America, I would say that at least in the Latin American experience of democracy, they're in front of us. Not so much in what they've accomplished, but in the stages they've gone through. Because before populism comes to the United States, it's in Latin America. It's Hugo Chavez and it's Alvaro Uribe in Colombia. And if you want the Western Hemisphere's first election denier, he's the current president of Mexico. Remember, he lost an election, AMLO lost an election to Felipe Castañeda, and refused to acknowledge that election and spent an entire year in the central plaza of Mexico City with an encampment of followers, all insisting that he hadn't lost the election. And there's been such kind of a leveling of democracy in the hemisphere that I would argue that, for instance, in a country like Brazil, the two greatest and largest democracies and economies in the Western Hemisphere, Brazil and the United States, are mimicking each other. And that what happens in Brazil happens in the United States, what happens in the United States happens in Brazil. And what this means, I think, or the opportunity that it creates, is that it opens up a space for solidarity. And it opens up a space for mutual understanding and mutual learning as we search for ways to make our institutions of government meaningful. And I think what's becoming very apparent is that the closer to the source you get, the better the government. And that central governments, it's difficult for them to resolve large national problems. And that state and municipal governments become much more important parts, building blocks in effective governance over time. And that when I talk about working with state institutions, it's also about how you build institutional connectivity from national or federal government to state or provincial to municipal government. And in this sense, I mean, look at the Western Hemisphere, from Canada to the tip of South America. It's a huge area. It's diverse. It's got every race, language, faith imaginable, every ethnic grouping imaginable. And it has, for the most part, a broad political commitment to democracy, broadly committed to common economic understandings about the importance of markets. And so it's this huge laboratory where you can try out all kinds of different things to see what works and what doesn't work. And this is what we, the multilateral development banks and others, really need to be focusing on right now, which is how do you begin to unlock the richness there? How do you begin to unlock the entrepreneurial spirit? How do you begin to unlock commitment to community in ways that show that democracy can deliver the goods?
Hi, yeah, you mentioned a couple ways that we can kind of protect, democracy. One of those ways is not accepting the status quo. What are some ways in your career that you have challenged the status quo? And what advice do you have for young people like myself who want to pursue a career in government but are intimidated by the amount of red tape and bureaucracy that makes it difficult to kind of create long-lasting change in a timely manner?
Yeah, no, thank you very much for that question. The first way you challenge the status quo is by helping people to understand the world differently. Diplomacy is really a form of cognitive therapy. It's really about changing behavior by getting people to understand reality differently. And Graeme mentioned that Washington is disconnected from the United States. There's a lot of truth to that. There's also a lot of truth to the fact that we have at least at the political level, a national security elite that is not only disconnected from voters, but also disconnected from most of the world. Because historically they have focused either on the Middle East, the Soviet Union, maybe China, or arms control. And when I became Undersecretary of State, I was a unicorn because I was the only Foreign Service officer who had spent his career in Latin America and Africa. I mean, we'd had one, Tom Pickering, who had been ambassador in Nigeria and ambassador in El Salvador and spoke Swahili and had his picture taken driving across the Sahara as a young man. But he was also ambassador in Moscow and New Delhi and Tel Aviv, got at the UN, and I'm not sure he would have described himself as a Latin Americanist. But there really is kind of a paucity of leadership across the board in the national security community in those countries that are really going to drive and change the world through the transitions that they're going through now. So helping people understand the world in a much bigger way, I think, is like the first step in this. And, let me give you a secret about bureaucracy and red tape. It's everywhere. I work now for a law firm. Good God. I got to check with people on everything so I don't somehow besmirch the good name of the law firm or end up in jail. I've got friends who work for other large corporations who are amazed that the level of bureaucracy they face is greater than than the U.S. government. But what is true about the U.S. government, though, especially the Department of State, you have to remember, the United States does not refer to its Ministry of Foreign Affairs as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It calls it the Department of State. There's only one other country in the world that refers to its foreign ministry as the Department of State. You know that? You know which one that is? It's the Vatican. And so if you're at the Department of State, you are representing the state. And that means you have to be really careful, because what you say has a profundity that it might not have if it were coming from the Department of Interior. Not that there's anything wrong with the Department of Interior. And so it just means that if you put yourself into that world, you're going into a fairly conservative institution that at times can appear to be hidebound because it's so careful about how it moves and what it says. But at the same time, what's great and fascinating about our government is because we have this regular turnover in leadership and presidencies, each administration is trying to do something new. Each administration is trying to define its historical role. And so it creates opportunities, both good and bad, for action. And it's a question of kind of knowing the field you're running in and knowing how you can get stuff done. And I would argue that this is not something that should intimidate you, that you should, and for instance, in my experience, I wound up at our embassy in Guatemala. I did 1 year as a consular officer where I was mostly working on visas and American citizen services and stuff. But then I spent a year in the political section where I was the human rights officer. I was the only person in that embassy doing human rights. And people didn't want anything to do with me because they didn't want anything to do with human rights. So I could go anywhere in that country I wanted to. I could talk to anybody I wanted to talk to. And whenever I showed up, I was an American diplomat. And so people would talk to me. And I realized that even though I was like the lowest of the low in the embassy, that I had this country that was just mine as far as where I could go and who I could talk to and what I could do. And then I could bring ideas back to the embassy and slowly begin to kind of build them into how the embassy was thinking and understanding about that country at a really important moment in political change. And it's then that I realized, wow, the U.S. government looks really big, it looks really intimidating, but once you get in there and you figure out where the crawl space is, you can do a lot. So. Okay. Well, listen, can I thank you all for your patience? Good. Well, Ambassador Boyd?
No, my comments, I've decided would be better in another forum.
Okay.
But I congratulate you on moving remarks.
Well, thank you. Okay. Go get him. No prisoners. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Sure, sure.
I'm just curious, you started talking about the agreement, the OAS agreement and definition of democracy. Where is it at right now, and sort of how is that definition being used, if at all, and sort of in that forum or other places?
Wonderful question. And, you know, in some ways, the Inter-American Democratic Charter was agreed to and written at almost the apogee of democratic development in the Western Hemisphere, in the sense that there was a consensus of sorts around what democracy was and how it operated. But as democracy opened up societies, you got the inclusion of voices around the hemisphere that had not been present before, and demands being made of government that had not been made before. In fact, what we were seeing is that national interests are not immutable, that they change depending on who's participating and identifying what's a national interest. And this was a very rich and dynamic period in the hemisphere of the region, because suddenly you had a presence in the politics of the country that had not existed before. This itself creates challenges and problems. But if you, for instance, there's something called the Latino Barometer, which is a polling, a longitudinal polling that is done and has been done in Latin America across decades. And it actually shows a decline in confidence in government and confidence in elections and elected governments in our hemisphere, very similar to what you see in the United States. But what you don't see is an uptick in interest in authoritarian or military governments. In other words, people are not looking to go back to a past. They want governments that work better. And a lot of these countries don't have the institutional structures yet to do what needs to be done. And we're finding that our own institutional structure is challenged for any number of reasons. And so this is why I think that we're at an important moment, especially as the region grapples with problems like Venezuela or Nicaragua, and tries to understand, okay, what do you do with a country like this that has just decided, we're a relatively small group of political leaders that just decided to hell with everybody. We're in charge. Sound familiar? We're in charge. We're not leaving government. Try to throw us out. And this is one of the bigger challenges the region kind of as a whole has to face. But I still remain very hopeful, because I spent a lot of time in this part of the world. And there's just this tremendous energy and tremendous purpose. And if we can find a way to tap into it, it'll be for the good. So, okay. Well, listen, thank you all very much. I wish you the best.